Hello and welcome to this live read of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh by Robert C. O'Brien. Today we'll be reading chapters 25 and 26 of the book. So let's get started. Chapter 25, Escape. At 10 by the kitchen clock, the Fitzgibbons went to bed. Dragon was put out, the doors locked, the lights turned off. The first of these things was done by Billy on instruction from his mother, not without some difficulty. He opened the door and said, "Come on, Dragon, out!" "He won't get up." "Oh, I never saw such a lazy cat. He gets worse every day." Finally, Dragon, protesting with only the sleepiest of whines, was picked up and deposited on the back porch. He scarcely opened his eyes. By that time it was dark. Mrs. Frisby waited a few minutes until she was sure that they were really gone, and until her eyes adjusted so she could see the bars of her cage. They were vertical bars, smooth and no thicker than matchsticks, which made them slippery to climb, but by turning more or less sideways she was able to grip them fairly well. She inched her way up to the sliding door and tried to lift it. She could tell from the first pull that it was no use. The door was stiff, and it was heavy, and she could not get a good enough grip on either it or the cage well to exert much pressure. Still, she kept trying, first lifting on the middle of the door, and then on one corner, then another, straining every muscle. In half an hour she admitted defeat, at least for the moment, and climbed back down to the bottom of the cage. She thought somehow she had to get out. Her children, even now, would be alone in the dark house, alone at night for the first time. Martin and Teresa would be trying to reassure the younger ones, yet they themselves would be sadly frightened. What would they think? Since she hadn't told them about Dragon and the sleeping powder, she hoped that perhaps they would decide that she had for some reason stayed with the rats. But at 11, which couldn't be far off, the rats would arrive to move the house. Or would they, knowing, since Justin must have told them, that she hadn't come out of the kitchen? She thought they would, she hoped they would, and that Justin would go with them and talk to the children and try to calm their fear. There was something about Justin, a kind of easy confidence that would help him. She no longer had any doubt, of course, that the rats could move her house. It was a generous thing to do, especially at a time when they were hurrying so into their plan, their own move, and they had no idea yet of how little time they had, of the new danger that crowded upon them. If she could only get out, she could run and warn them, and it might still not be too late. She thought, "It's a good plan and a brave one. It would be the first time in all the world that intelligent beings besides men have ever tried to start a real civilization of their own. They ought to have a chance." It wasn't right that they should be killed at the last minute, or captured. Could it be that they, the men who were coming, were somehow connected with Nimh? Or was it more likely, as Paul had guessed, that they were only worried about rabies? She decided it didn't really matter. The result would be the same. The day after next, the truck would come with its poison gas, and that would be the end of all their plans. Unless they could be warned. Wearily, she got up to climb the wall and try the door again. She heard a noise. It was in the kitchen, near her cage, a small scuffling on the hard linoleum floor. Now what kind of bird can that be with no wings? It was Justin's voice, soft, and he was laughing a bit. "Justin!" "I thought you might like to come home. Your children are asking after you." "Are they all right?" "They're fine. They were worried, but I told them I'd bring you back. They seem to believe me." "But how did you know that you were here? You forget. I was waiting just under the cabinet. I heard what happened. I felt like biting Billy full of holes. But as soon as I heard that you were safely in the cage, I went and told the children you were all right, but that you'd be a little late. I didn't tell them exactly why. Now let's get you out." "I tried. I couldn't open the door." "I'll get it open. I brought along a few tools. Burglar's tools, you might say, in my backpack. Should I climb up the stand?" It looks slippery. I think I'll try that curtain." In a matter of seconds, Justin had swarmed up a window curtain a foot away, and she heard a thump as he leaped and landed on top of the cage, which swayed under the impact. The noise was slight, but they both listened intently for a moment to see if it produced another from upstairs. All was quiet. Now let's look at that door. Justin climbed down easily. Oh, I hope you can get it open. I can, Justin said, examining it. Easily enough, but I don't think I will. Why not? Because you couldn't, Justin said. They'll know that, so they won't be curious. Let's make it open itself. Ah, as I expected, it doesn't have real hinges. He had pulled a small metal bar out of his backpack and was working as he talked. Just little wire rings, dime store quality, these cheap flimsy things. They're always coming apart. And as he said that, one of them came apart. The door sagged and hung crazily by one corner. There, you see? You couldn't help it if they put you in a defective cage. Come on out. Mrs. Frisby climbed through and stood with Justin on the top of the cage. Now, he said, we shimmy down the stand like a fireman's pole. You go out the way you came in, under the cabinet, through the hole. I'll go out the way I came in, through the attic. I'll meet you outside. Justin, Mrs. Frisby said, there's something I've got to tell you. Something I've learned. Wait till we're out, said Justin. We've got to hurry. We're having a little trouble moving your cinder block. He was off, running silently in front of the house, from which the stairway led up 2 flights to the attic. Mrs. Frisby crawled under the cabinet, searching in total darkness for a small hole. She finally felt one. A foot slipped down, and she dropped through. The square opening in the foundation was easier to find. It glowed palely ahead of her, lit with moonlight. Justin was waiting for her as she came out of the corner on the screen. The night was warm, and a half-moon shone at the farmyard. Now, he said, what was it that you wanted to tell me? He spoke seriously. He had heard the urgency in her voice. They hurried toward the garden, rounding the back porch. There, a dark heap in the moonlight, lay Dragon, no threat to anyone tonight. Some exterminators are coming to poison all of you, Mrs. Frisby told him, as briefly as she could, of the conversation that she had heard at the Fitzgibbons' dinner table. 7 rats, Justin said. Rabies? It might be, but I'll bet it was Jenner. When are the men supposed to come? The day after tomorrow. To her surprise, Justin stopped. He looked at her in admiration. You know, he said, I had a feeling the first time I clapped eyes on you that you would bring us good luck. Good luck? She was amazed. Oh, no, it's bad news. It's serious. We'll have to change our plans, and quickly, but think how much worse it would be if you hadn't have overheard it. We wouldn't have had a chance. They came into the garden. Is Nicodemus here? Mrs. Frisby asked. No. In a few minutes I'll go and tell him, but first we need your help to get started moving your house. My help? What can I do? You can talk to your neighbor. She seems to think we're stealing your cinder block. She bit Arthur on the leg. At one end of the big stone in the middle of the garden, 10 rats were digging briskly, using scoops that looked more like teaspoons than shovels, piling the earth neatly beside a hole already big enough to hold Mrs. Frisby's house. But on the other side of the stone, there was an impasse. Here, another 10 rats stood, baffled in a semicircle. Behind them, they had deposited a jumble of equipment, odd-shaped metal bars, pulleys, wooden structures that looked like ladders, other pieces of wood that resembled small logs, but between the rats and Mrs. Frisby's front door stood a small, defiant figure. Why, said Mrs. Frisby to Justin, it's the shrew. Yeah, said Justin, and she's acting shrewish. One of the rats was speaking. Mrs. Frisby recognized Arthur. But I told you, ma'am, we do have Mrs. Frisby's permission. She wants us to move her house. Ask the children. Call them out. Don't tell me that. What have you done with Mrs. Frisby? It's a good thing the children haven't heard you. They'd be frightened half to death. If Mrs. Frisby wanted you to move her house, she'd be here. It's all right, called Mrs. Frisby, running forward. I'm here. Frisby, said the shrew. You're just in time. I heard a noise and came and found these creatures trying to dig up your house. I tried to explain it to her, said Arthur, but she won't believe me. I certainly won't, said the shrew. You said you asked him to dig up your house. Oh, these thieving rats. It's true, Mrs. Frisby said. I did ask them, and they said they would help. It's very kind of them. Kind, said the shrew. Great hulking beasts. What do you mean? It took several more minutes of reassurance by Mrs. Frisby before the shrew grudgingly moved aside, still muttering her warnings. I wouldn't trust them. How do you know they'll do what they say? And that, of course, Mrs. Frisby could not explain to her. The rats now commenced to dig busily at the dirt on top and around Mrs. Frisby's block. Justin said, I've got to go talk to Nicodemus. You'd better get the children out. Mrs. Frisby hurried inside her house, and she found the children waiting in the living room, unaware of the small crisis that had been taking place outside. As Justin had said, they didn't seem worried. We were scared at first, Teresa said, but then one of the rats came to see us. He couldn't come in, but he called to us, and we came out, Martin and I. He said his name was Justin. Have you met him? He's very nice. I've met him, said Mrs. Frisby. Now we'd better go outside. They're getting ready to move the house. I'm ready, said Timothy. I'm all wrapped up, like a scarecrow. Martin and Teresa had taken pieces of warm cloth from the bed and tied them around him. Mrs. Frisby couldn't see him in the dark, but when she touched him, she found that he had even tied a piece like a bonnet around his head and ears. Good, she said, and we're lucky. It's a warm night and dry. They went up the small tunnel to the garden and watched in the moonlight from a hill a few feet away. The rats had finished digging the new hole, and all 20 of them were working near the house. It was quite a sight. As soon as the earth had been cleared from the top and side of the cinder block, it lay fully exposed in its hole. All the rats turned to the pile of equipment. Under Arthur's direction, the ladder-like structures became scaffolding, 4 small towers standing one near each corner of the block. Across the top of these rats fastened strong, light bars of metal, probably from the toy tinker's truck. From these bars they now hung pulleys wound with strong, thin cord, and at the end of the cords they fastened hooks, which they slipped into the oval-shaped holes in the blocks and pulled hard. Heave! Called Arthur. The 20 rats strained on the cords, and the block rose an inch. Heave! Another inch. Slowly, the heavy block rose from the hole until it hung 2 inches above level ground. Steady, said Arthur. Get the rollers under there. 8 rats ran to the round pieces of wood Mrs. Frisby had noticed early. 2 rats to a roller, they slipped 4 of them under the cinder block, so they lay over the hole, like bars across a window. Lower away! Let's see how it rolls, said Arthur. I slipped the ropes free of the pulleys and rehooked 2 of them to the front of the block. Heave! The rollers turned, and the heavy block slid forward easily, like a truck on wheels, in the direction of the new hole. When it moved, the last roller went back in front, and so on and so forth. Almost like a game of leapfrog, Mrs. Frisby thought. But a well-rehearsed game. The rats had planned carefully. They knew exactly what they were doing. Within the very few minutes, the first of the rollers lay across the new hole, then the second, and finally all 4. The block was poised and in position. The hole was exactly the right size and shape. The towers and pulleys were put up again, and the whole process of lifting and lowering was done in reverse. It's done, cried Mrs. Frisby. She felt like applauding. Not quite yet, said Arthur over his shoulder. Get the shovels and the backpacks. Pausing a moment to rest, he explained to Mrs. Frisby. We're going to cover it with turf, and then we've got to fill up the old hole with the dirt from the new one, or Mrs. Fitzgibbon will wonder who's been digging up his garden. Also, we've still got to dig you an entrance hole. In her excitement, Mrs. Frisby had forgotten this small detail. She couldn't get into her new house. Now she watched in awe as Arthur and Brutus, using 2 small, long-handed shovels, dug the narrow tunnel down to her living room. It took them less than 5 minutes. It had taken her all day to dig the other one. Now, said Arthur, you can put up your children to bed, and we'll take care of the rest. Chapter 26. At the Meeting. Mrs. Frisby slept well and soundly. The day just finished having been the longest and hardest that she had ever known. She awoke in the morning with a smile. Her house was warm, and it was safe at last. Her children slept peacefully beside her. Timothy's breathing was quiet and easy. They could stay in the house now as long as they needed to. On some warm day, later in the spring, when Timothy was strong again, they would move the summer house down by the brook. Another nice thing, she thought. When they left the house, She would close up the entrance tunnel so that no one could find it. Undisturbed by the plow, it would be ready and waiting for them in the fall. It could be theirs forever, thanks to the rats. The rats! In her half-dreaming state, she had forgotten. They were in terrible danger. What would they do? At that moment, she heard a voice calling her name from above. Mrs. Frisby! She left the bed and went to the bottom of the entrance hole. Yes? Who's calling? It's me, Brutus. Can you come up? Mrs. Frisby climbed up and out of her front door, blinking in the early morning sunlight. Nicodemus wants to know if you can come with me. He's having a meeting. Just let me wake the children and tell them. 2 minutes later, she was walking with Brutus towards the rose bush. What does Nicodemus want? It's about the men. Justin told us last night. Nicodemus thinks that they must be from Nimh. He wants to ask you more about what Mr. Fitzgibbon said. That morning, there were 2 rats on sentry duty. One just inside the entrance to the rose bush, watching the house. Another at the arch where Brutus had stood. All of the rest were gathered in the large assembly room that Mrs. Frisby had seen when she got off the elevator. Nicodemus, Justin, Arthur, and 2 other rats sat on a raised platform at the end. The rest sat facing them. Mrs. Frisby had never seen so many rats. Even the young ones were present. She spotted Isabella staring up at the platform with wide, round eyes. Some of the mothers held small babies at their side. Most of them looked anxious. There was an air of tension. Brutus led her up the center aisle to the raised platform. There was a table on it covered with papers, and one vacant space where a chair had been placed for Mrs. Frisby. Nicodemus said, quite formally, Justin has told us all that happened, Mrs. Frisby. It seems you have more than repaid us for the help we gave you in moving your house. Just as your husband did once, you have saved us from disaster. Death or capture, we don't know which. Justin gave her a wink. Mrs. Frisby had a taste of capture herself last night. Would you tell us, as well as you can remember it, word for word, what Mr. Fitzgibbon said about the rats and about the men who were at the store? As well as I can remember it, Mrs. Frisby's voice sounded small in the big room. Mr. Fitzgibbon said a strange thing had happened in the hardware store. Henderson's, he called it. Her memory was good. She had listened with great care to what the farmer had said, and she was able to recall the whole conversation word for word. The rat sat quietly while she told it. Then Nicodemus went back over it, asking questions. You say that Mr. Fitzgibbon said 6 or 7 rats. Did he ever say which number it really was? No, I don't think he paid much attention to the number. Jenner's group was 7, said Justin, but it could be a coincidence. Did he say how far away the town was where this happened? Did he name it? No, but it mustn't be far. He's been there and back that day. Did anyone see his car go out? Nicodemus asked the others. I heard it, Brutus said. I was on duty. It went after lunch. And he was back by dinner. But which direction? If we knew, we might send someone. You see, Nicodemus explained to Miss Frisby, we need to know who those men are. If they're from Nimh, things are much worse for us. We'd never make it, said Arthur. Driving at, say, 40 or 50 miles an hour? Fitzgibbon might have gone 15 or 20 miles in any direction, and he would return easily the same afternoon. On the map you can see it could have been any one of half a dozen small towns. Each of them have a hardware store. Ah, you're right, of course, said Nicodemus. Without the name, the idea is hopeless. He turned back to Mrs. Frisby. Fitzgibbon said the rats were grouped around the motor, as if they were trying to move it? Well, that's what he said the store owner told him. He didn't see it himself. And that the motor was plugged in, had been left plugged in, Mrs. Frisby quoted. But we don't know who plugged it in. I got the impression, Mrs. Frisby said, from the way he said it, that the store owner had left it plugged in. But I'm not sure. That would make sense, Arthur said. If it was Jenner, and if they had plugged it in themselves, they'd have known better than to try to move it. They must not have realized. It was probably pretty dark in the store. Poor Jenner, said Nicodemus. I wish he had stayed with us. It'll be poor us, said one of the rats, if we don't get on with this. He didn't mention the doctor's name. Did he say even a word about what he looked like? No. Did he describe the truck at all? No, only that it was full of equipment. Are you sure about the headline in the paper? Mechanized rats invade hardware store. I'm sure that's what Mr. Fitzgibbon said it was, but I don't think he saw it. He didn't say so. In a way, that's the most puzzling thing about the whole story, Nicodemus said. Well, why is that? Asked Justin. Because the headline doesn't really fit the facts. You don't call a bunch of dead rats mechanized just because you find them on a shelf near a motor. Maybe not, said the nameless rat, but then why did the newspaper say that? I'm wondering, Nicodemus said, if perhaps there wasn't more to the story. Some stronger reason to think that they were really taking the motor away, or that they knew how to use it. Well, maybe some other motors had been stolen, Justin said, or some tools. That would make them seem mechanized. It would, said Nicodemus, and it would explain what the doctor meant when he said that they had more checking to do in town. They're looking for the things that were missing, Arthur said, sounding worried. They're looking for Jenner's headquarters, and if they find it, we're just guessing, of course, Nicodemus said, but it is a possibility. A bad one. It means that we have no choice. We've got to assume they're from Nimh. We've also got to assume that by now they may have found Jenner's headquarters, whatever cave or cavern they were using. And, said Justin, now they're looking for us. Well, why for us? Asked one of the rats. Why wouldn't they think Jenner's group are the only ones? They might, Nicodemus admitted, but I don't think so. After all, they know that there were 20 of us originally. Why would there only be 7 now? And we already know that they're coming out here in quite a hurry at that. So if they're from Nimh, obviously they are looking for us. I think, said Arthur, that we've got to make some plans and quick. I agree, said Nicodemus. It's a new situation and a tricky one. We won't be able to do everything we hope to. There isn't time, and somehow we have to convince the exterminators when they come that we aren't more of the mechanized rats they're looking for. We won't be able to move any more food to Thorn Valley, Justin said. We'll have to get along on what we've already got stored there, about an 18-month supply if we're careful. The seeds, I believe, are already moved? Yes, said Arthur. The last load went yesterday. So with luck we'll have our own first crops this summer and fall. We won't have time to destroy the motors or the books or the furniture as we planned. Instead, we'll have to move everything to the cave. We'll seal off the entrances as if it never existed. That can be done, Arthur said. But there's more. We've got to pull all the wires and lights from the tunnel. They're likely to dig it up. And the carpet. We've got to tear down this arch. And then, when all that's done, when everything is hidden in the cave, we'll fill in the stairway and the elevator shaft. We'll seal off everything, except the upper storage room and the tunnels. When they dig, let them find that room. It's as big as any ordinary rat hole. Justin, tonight take a group of a dozen or so. Go to the Fitzgibbon garbage can. Bring back a load of the worst-smelling garbage you can find. The storage room is going to become an ordinary, typical rat hole, not in the least mechanized or civilized. What do you think? I think we can do it all. We won't get much sleep, though, Justin said. There's one more thing. Won't they think it's odd, especially if they're from Nimh finding just an empty hole? I was coming to that, Nicodemus said. Tomorrow morning, as soon as it's light, the main group leaves for Thorn Valley, but some of us will have to stay behind. As Justin says, if they find just an empty hole, they'll sure to be suspicious, and they'll keep on digging. So when they come with their gas truck, they've got to find some rats here. A rear guard. I'd say at least 10. Mrs. Frisby walked slowly home, keeping to the edge of the woods, keeping out of sight. Justin had volunteered for the rear guard. Brutus was second, and behind him 8 more. There were 50 more waiting behind them. Enough, enough, said Nicodemus. Isabella, in tears, had run forward. I want to stay, please, she had pleaded, looking despairingly at Justin. No children, said Nicodemus, and her mother led her away, still weeping. These 10, the 10 who would remain, did not face certain death, nor certain capture. The exterminators, they would presume, especially if they cleared away the rosebush, the rats would be alerted. When the men pumped gas as expected into the hole, the pump would also make a noise. The air below would move as the gas flowed in. When they felt that, the rats would scramble out the back exit, past the sealed-off cave, and emerge as noiselessly as possible in the blackberry bramble bush. They would show themselves, and they would dash off into the woods. But won't they block the rear exit? We'll put a net over it? We'll give them another rear exit to block, Arthur had said cryptically. One that's easier to find. Mother, why are you so quiet? Asked Teresa. They were sitting down to dinner for the very first time in their newly moved house. You seem sad. I suppose I am, Mrs. Frisby said, because the rats are all going away. But that's no reason. It's true they moved our house, and we were nice to them, but we didn't really know them. I was getting to know them pretty well. Well, where are they going? To a new home, a long way away. Well, when? Tomorrow morning. Will you go to see them off? I think I will. But why are they moving away? Asked Timothy. Because they want to, said Mrs. Frisby. Someday, soon, she would tell them the whole story. But not that night. Well, that's the end of that chapter. Come back tomorrow for the final 2 chapters in Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh. After that, we'll be reading Charlotte's Web, 2 chapters at a time, every day at 1:30. So that begins on Wednesday this week. Until then, hope you're staying happy, healthy, and safe. Hope you're enjoying the nice weather outside. And I hope you enjoyed this reading of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh.